My name is Rafiq. My question to Sir Suma, it's something very interesting I heard from him when he mentioned about his helping the Turkish people for entrepreneurship or giving them funds without collateral. So this I would really like him to elaborate some of his points.
Because there are lots of people that want to ask questions, I think I'm going to stick to one question per person. So is that your question?
That was my...
All right, okay. Can you just tell us who you are as well? I forgot to say, please.
My name is Rafiq. I'm Managing Director, Micro, Small, Medium Enterprises.
Okay, perfect. The lady next.
Hi, I'm Anna Hertenstein from Bloomberg. My question is for Mr. Zhu. You mentioned that the AIIB will be focusing on energy supply and that it'll be lean, clean, and green. So I wanted to ask you what the AIIB's stance on coal-fired power plants will be, and whether you'll be financing coal-fired power plants. Thank you.
Okay, there was one just over there on the right-hand side.
Hi, my name is Denise Gambold. I'm with Eclipse Energy Group. Bearing in mind, well, this question is for all the speakers. So bearing in mind the growth of the AIIB, and we can no doubt expect more multilateral development banks to grow, what, in your opinion, is the level of information sharing, knowledge sharing, and expertise sharing, and what's the scope for this going forward? Thanks.
Okay, so Suma, there was one question there on Turkey for you. Do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, that's probably easiest if I actually send you, Rafiq, the Women in Business document that we have, which actually sets out everything that we're doing and how we got around some of the problems. We will also, I hope, inshallah, on the 9th of December, approve in our board the gender strategy going forward. The first time ever that EBRD has had a full-scale gender strategy. It's now fully part of our open market economy transition model, and that will set out also the countries where we feel particularly we must work, particularly on some of the gender issues, to get female entrepreneurs and others into the marketplace, give them more access. Beyond just finance, actually, build capability in banks, and so they understand how to work with many of these entrepreneurs. So that, again, so that the 9th of December, soon after that, we'll publish the document as well. But the Women in Business document, I think, is available now, so we'll get it to you and anyone else who's interested. Can I just, on the knowledge sharing point, can I just pick that up?
Absolutely, yeah.
I think it's really crucial. So what has happened this year is really interesting, and it goes back to the point Stephanie and Chris were making, I think, about how the creation of the AIIB is actually a very interesting moment, because they are able to cherry pick, if you like, the best lessons of what to do from what's happened and what to avoid as well. But it's also led the rest of us this year, I know from my bank, to have so many workshops with the AIIB in China, but also outside China, on various aspects of how we run a bank. And from this, what we're getting is actually quite a lot of synergy, lesson learning. The issue, I think, you're right to raise, is going forward, this is great at the creation of a bank, can we maintain it in the period after the bank's been created? Or do we go back into competitive behavior? And I really think we must try and maintain the spirit of 2015 going forward, and particularly the AIIB actually being a springboard for that.
Okay, great, thanks. Changwoo, do you want to comment on this thorny issue of being lean and green, but how much you may or may not, or the AIIB may or may not invest in coal-fired power stations?
Thank you for your question. Actually, this is a very, very sensitive issue, even controversial to all multilateral institutions, including the World Bank. We have a very heated debate on that. To be quite frank, I don't think, I'm not policymakers. However, in my opinion, this issue will be discussed, and the decision will be made by the future board. However, if it could be, fund some of the coal-burning factories or not factories, power plants, that would be high standard and clean. Thank you.
Can I have another round of questions? Maybe over here? Yep. Just say who you are and your question.
Thank you very much. I'm Haider Rida from Bain & Company. My question is about one of the key trends we see, the increased interest or activity of non-governmental social impact financing vehicles from traditional corporate investors all the way to really new investors like private equity, social impact funds from private equity world, or infrastructure funds. So my question is, does that mean that the multilateral development banks need to focus on a specific part of the market with a specific profile of risks and return which the other players are not invested in? Or do you see them more as living together? And could you give one example of that? For example, the oil and gas countries now, which have a huge impact, obviously, of the oil and gas crisis. How do you see these different players working together for an integrated effort to help these countries in these difficult situations?
Great.
Thanks.
Okay. This question at the back here.
My name is Nzita. I'm an independent economist. My question is really about the guide you produce here and the mandate of the African Development Bank and the EBRD. So now, what I notice here for African Development Bank, you said to promote sustainable economic growth and reduce poverty. But for EBR, a transition from communism to market economy, and also to promote democracy and the private sector. But we all know very well, African countries after the colonial period, many of these countries were led by left-wing countries. And why this mandate of promoting to democracy is not a mandate for the African Development Bank for Angola, Congo, Brazzaville, all these communities. So my question is why there is this gap. You promote transition to market economy and communist, but for Africa it is sustainable
that's great.
development.
We're clear about that. So we'll answer it in the round. So last question in this round here.
I'm John Burton from KPMG. I just wondered within the total bill for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, how much of that can be financed through the MDBs, and what are the main constraints for really scaling up MDB finance? Thanks.
Okay. So a question on, first of all, should MDBs focus on specific bits of the market, given all these, non-government financing vehicles that are emerging? Suma, is that one that you want to?
Yeah, happy to take maybe that and the second one as well. I mean, I think I can't comment on the oil and gas industry so much, but there's undoubtedly a gap in the market in the countries EBRD serves, the 36 countries, in private equity funding. So we are actually, most of our countries are starved of long-term capital. And so if you look at equity, we did quite a bit early on in the when EBRD was created in the 90s, but there was low-hanging fruit stuff. I think it's become much more difficult. It's about 12% of what we do every year. And the returns haven't been as good as they were in the early days, I think, as well. So we really need to up our own capability. We need to get better at doing this. There's a question of incentives, because in private equity, as you know, people actually get paid on the basis of returns to companies. We can't do that in a publicly owned bank. There's also, I think, a question of how to attract people or funds who are not investing in our countries of operation. So for us, many sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, do not currently do that. So what we've done this year, and it's just been approved by our board, and we're going to go to our first close quite soon, is create an equity participation fund. And I'm very proud and honoured, actually, that SAFE from China will be our first contributor to that. They're going to make a 250 million contribution. It'll close quite soon. This is very, very interesting, because if this happens, if we get this off the ground, I think then it'll lead to others having confidence, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, having confidence in coming and joining this equity participation fund and increasing equity in our region. Equity has much higher transition value than debt finance, generally, so that's going to be quite interesting too. Just to go to that gentleman's question, I mean, these banks were created at different times, so they have different mandates. So the first article of EBRD, because it was created in 1991, soon after the Berlin Wall fell, democracy in Eastern Europe was a big thing for the creation of the bank. That's what spurred the creation of the bank. the African Development Bank created much earlier, as you say, and so it didn't have that mandate. So the democracy mandate only exists in the EBRD's case, actually. So we have this unusual article compared with every other multilateral. But it's a historical reason. And it's important to us. I think a lot of our staff, and one of the reasons I joined, is the commitment to it. And you need commitment to move towards democracy. No one has arrived. You never arrive at the democracy station, I think, but you keep moving towards it. You have to be committed to pluralist politics and market-based economic policies. So it's that duality that makes up the transition model very much.
Stephanie, I just want to bring you in also on this question of private finance and the intersection between that and the MDBs.
I think one interesting area, complementing what Suma said, is thinking about new instruments, for example, equity-like instruments. And I was on Monday at a conference organized by the Bank of England, which is trying to promote what is called GDP-linked bonds, which is a sort of mixture of debt and equity, whereby these loans could be serviced more if the country is doing very well and less if the country is not growing or is in trouble. And one interesting idea raised there was that perhaps institutions like the World Bank or the EBRD or the AIIB could lend in that modality and thus help, as in other cases, as in the case of local currency bonds, to create a new market. And secondly, I think you were referring also to more kind of renewable energy, socially responsible investment. Should one think of promoting further, for example, instruments like green bonds, which are attractive for such investors? Should that be done through the promotion of environmental standards? Or should there be an overall strategy which would say we want to shift more towards renewables, and how can the particular development bank, for example, the AIIB, help promote that strategy, which is, I think, perhaps the most positive way of doing that.
Okay. And Kiyoshi, this question of how can the MDBs support, sustain, finance the SDGs?
Well, first of all, nobody has tried to identify the entire cost of achieving SDGs, and because we don't know what exact number, quantitative number should attach to these 168 targets, and this work is still ongoing. However, this rough roadmap paper, which ODI has produced, very interesting. The assumption is here. For instance, all the developing countries run 3% current account deficit. How much it add up to? 1 trillion per year. This is 15, 16 the prices. So from here, you may want to guess, but the Suma has already announced that all the MDBs altogether has announced 400 billion for the next for the SDGs. And if the capital were to be increased, then this 400 billion can be further up, and we haven't count on AIIB, and also the PPP. We really have to mobilize the private sector funds, and also the better in-depth capital market in country, outside country. And I'm looking at the 2013 figure of the entire global capital the flow. It's 1.8 trillion.
Okay, and a question, and the last question, because we're running up to time. Last question comes from our online audience. Question from Catherine Liu, and it is for Zhang Wu. China has become internationally renowned for its work in developing a green finance framework. How will the AIIB and the MDB draw on China's experience in green finance to the bank's new operations? And do you think China can provide leadership in fostering green finance leadership in these new banks?
Thank you for the good question. And I think the Paris meeting is now going on, and the Chinese delegation has made some joint efforts there, and in particular with some of the major players, including the United States and some other countries. However, we will do our part, to the climate change, to provide not only some experience, but also some more funds, including we have already set up a South-South cooperation fund on climate change. That shows our determination. Thank you.
Very much. And just before we close, I wanted to bring in Annalisa Prisson. She is leading our research in this field and will give us just a brief overview of what to look out for next in this.
Thank you very much, Ishbel. And I guess a full house here in London and so many of you online really clearly show the relevance and the timeliness of this discussion around the future of multilateral development banks. As Ishbel was kind of mentioning at the very beginning, we're expanding our program of work on multilateral development banks. And let me highlight a couple of examples that contribute to the evidence base for this agenda. Kyoshi, first of all, has already mentioned the Financing the SDGs, a rough roadmap that I co-authored with Andrew Rogerson, who is in the room today, and with Homi Karas. And it was one of the contributions ahead of the Financing for Development conference, and he shaped some of the arguments on the role of MDBs, and in particular in the provision of non-concessional funding to lower middle-income countries. Second, Chris Humphrey, on my right, led a series of publications on the creation and potential operational scale of the AIIB and the MDB. And third, today we actually, we mentioned a few times the series of op-eds that Stephanie, Richard, and Chris contributed to on the role of China and the newly established institutions and implications for the MDB architecture. And also we released a short guide on MDBs. We hope it will help navigate the landscape of MDBs for those who are less familiar with it. But this is very much the past, and right after the end of the event, during the reception, you can browse all the publications that are outside. I think it's much more interesting to talk about what comes next and how ODI will kind of contribute to this agenda that we discussed today. First of all, we talk about challenges for the MDBs in the presentations, and I don't want to go back to those. But we are currently working on an analytical paper reviewing these challenges in more detail. And in particular, we're kind of reviewing the extent to which each MDB, global, regional, sub-regional, is actually potentially exposed to a series of disruptors to their mandates, ranging from the supply side and to governance, just to name a couple of them. We haven't really touched upon the issues of the review of the graduation process out of concessional windows of multilateral development banks. We're currently reviewing the different propositions that were proposed in the past, and we're trying to kind of come up with the ones that are most feasible in terms of kind of implementation and financial sustainability. Also here at ODI, that's the third point, we have a program of work on the future of development agencies. And this program explores the implications of development, of the changes in the development agenda, and supports agencies in shaping the strategic, institutional, and operational future, both bilateral and multilateral agencies. And let me conclude with a final point. I mean, we were talking about the perspectives of recipient countries, the demand side. At ODI, over the last 3 years, we've been working on a project called Age of Choice, what the development finance landscape means for partner countries. We wanted to kind of investigate the preferences and priorities from the side of ministries of finance in developing countries. And there's certainly kind of clear scope to expand this work, to try and understand what recipients' preferences are and the demand for concessional and non-concessional financing from the side of recipient countries again. So there are quite a few projects happening, and I trust this will be the first of many events where we kind of engage on this type of agenda. So please watch this space in the new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And of course, you'll be available later, and members of the team outside in the wine reception, if anybody wants to ask you further about that. But it just remains for me to thank this panel for what has been a really fascinating discussion. Of course, thanks to Sosuma Chakrabarti, Kiyosha Kadera, Jianwen Zhou, and of course Stephanie Griffiths-Jones. Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion here today at ODI. Thank you.